Okay, hello and welcome to today's event, everyone. I'm Jason Gumpert from msdynamicsworld.com, and I am joined by Mike Cassidy, VP of Development at FastPath, and Kevin McCreary, Associate Director at Protiviti, for a session on establishing a clean slate security environment for Dynamics AX, either for new or existing systems. As we get started today, please know that you can add your feedback and ask questions using the Q&A block that you should see to the right side of the main webcast presentation window here. Mike and Kevin will be leaving time at the end for questions, so please do enter those at any time. And also please be on the lookout for a few polls we'll be running during the event today, starting in just a couple moments. So without further delay, please allow me to welcome Mike to start things off.
Thank you, Jason. As Jason mentioned, my name is Mike Cassidy. I just want to welcome everyone to our session on strategies for a clean slate security environment in Dynamics AX. I work for FastPath. I'm the Vice President of Development here, so I work with our technical team. At FastPath, we're an ISV. We build security, audit, and compliance tools. We work with a lot of customers that have compliance requirements, helping them really design their security around their controls so that they can have a clean slate, if you will, in those areas. So I come at it from both a technical perspective and also from a compliance perspective, working with our customers. Kevin McCreary, I'll let him go ahead and introduce himself and give you a little background on Protiviti.
Thanks, Mike. So my name is Kevin McCreary. I'm an Associate Director with Protiviti, working in our ERP Solutions practice. Our ERP Solutions practice is part of our IT consulting group, and Protiviti is a organization that provides business solutions for many organizations, primarily in the risk and compliance area. We're about 3,500 individuals across 74 offices, and we are a wholly owned subsidiary of Robert Half.
So let's go ahead and move forward, and we expected to kind of have a heavy amount of 2012 R3 customers. Today we're really going to go in and talk about how to design that clean slate security environment and try to alleviate some of the concerns you may have with your approach. We'll talk about different methodologies and how you can go about building that security, and also talk about how you can build your compliance requirements into that model. So you really need to think about segregation of duties and other compliance requirements as you're building your security model. So it's important to do it all as one rather than trying to worry about compliance after the fact when you may have to redesign some of your security at that point. So these are the topics we're going to go into. We're going to talk about the segregation of duties approach, some of the remediation portion of that, also some of the controls that can go along with that as well. We'll go into role design, both from a technical perspective and also from a high level, the process you'll use around that, and then talk about some of the teams and give you some examples of how you can go about accomplishing this, the different team members you'll have to engage, some of the schedules you can put around that, and design of your security. So before we get started, before we go any further, we really need to jump in and talk about the security model and make sure that everyone understands how security works in AX. So now everyone is probably familiar that the security model has changed between AX 2009 and 2012. In AX 7, it is the same framework carried forward. There are some differences that do come into play, but they're, in general, the general structure of security remains the same. In the AX 2012 model, we have a concept of roles, duties, and privileges. That's really a hierarchy where you have roles at the top level. Those are really kind of jobs that exist in your system. They're made up of duties and privileges, which are breakdowns of those basically functions that make up that job. And then your privileges ultimately have access to entry points, which gain access to securable objects. So that's where you're really going to get down into your menu items and your tables and those different elements. Now, as you see on the slide here, we kind of mapped it out so you can see how the security architecture works here. So, you know, your employee, that's really going to tie to a user in the system. Users are assigned to roles. So that's really the first thing you're going to see is the user can only be assigned access via a role. In AX 2009, it was a security group. So those security groups they didn't really have the hierarchy, so they were just kind of, the group had everything you needed, which made it a little bit more difficult to manage. So those roles, as you can see, are made up of duties and privileges, and ultimately the privileges are going to give you access to security points. As we start talking about that security and designing that security, we also want to start thinking about segregation of duties. So as I mentioned, you really, if you do have segregation of duties as a requirement, you want to take that into account as you're going in and building out your security model. So when we talk about SoD and segregation of duties, we really break it down into two different areas, what we call intra-conflicts and inter-SoD conflicts. And the difference here is intra-conflicts is when you design a role that will be assigned to a user that contains conflicts within that role. So there are going to be cases, let's say we develop an AP clerk, we design an AP clerk role. If there are conflicting access within that role itself, that means every user that gets access to that role is automatically going to have those conflicts. And so we really want to push for designing roles that are free of conflicts, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But the idea would be, in a perfect world, we would design every role free of conflicts. Then when we start talking about inter-conflicts, we're talking about when a user is assigned to multiple roles, that there can be conflicts that are generated when you combine all of that access. So when you assign a user multiple roles to a user, it takes an aggregate of all of that access to determine what that user's security profile is. And there are a couple tricky things with that. There can be times where you may test a role, for example, and you go to a forum, you have access to the forum and everything works as you would expect. And then you may combine that with another role, and what you'll find is that the command buttons, so the insert, often they're the create, the add, edit, and delete within AX, those are command buttons, and they are tied to table level access. And so what happens is if you combine two roles, where one role may have view access to a menu item and another role has edit access to the table, all of a sudden those buttons start lighting up on a view window because you've made an aggregate of that security, and all of a sudden something has been activated that you didn't expect. So you always want to make sure you test the user's security profile, not just for each role independently, but as holistic for what that user is really going to experience when they're in the system. And also test your SoD methodology against the multiple role scenario to understand the inter-conflicts. So that's really what a user has at the user security level. That is one thing in AX7, I will give you a heads up, has changed. The whole idea that table level access could enable some command buttons in the system when you combine roles, that no longer applies. In AX7, they honor menu item or entry point access. So if you have view access to the entry point, there's no way that you would get more than view access, even if you combine with a role that has table level access. That is one of the big changes. That is a very nice change. It's a step in the right direction as far as security is concerned. So I do want to show you a couple examples here of some segregation of duties that we, these are just kind of some high-level ones we often see. I'll go ahead and pick the classic example there, the very last one. The ability to create a fictitious vendor and initiate payment to that vendor. That's the most classic example out there that you'll find. The idea here is that we want to prevent a role in our role design from having that access because we don't want to have intra-conflicts. And then also we want to analyze our system for user access. So when they have multiple roles assigned to them, to identify, once we combine all their roles together, do they have a conflict based on that aggregate security profile that's created by the multiple roles. And so we want to identify that and ideally eliminate that or remediate that situation, but also remember that there can be controls in place. And again, we'll talk about that as we go forward. There may be cases where you do some mitigation with compensating controls. I think that brings us to our second poll question. Jason, if you could go ahead and Yep, it's up. Thank you very much. How are you currently handling your segregation of duties analysis in Dynamics AX? Are you using a manual process going into Excel or doing some sort of extract of data from the database and doing it manually? Are you using a third-party tool such as FastPath? You may be using the GRC Studio tools that are provided by FastPath that allow you to do segregation of duties and security access, critical access analysis. You could be using native tools within AX. There are a couple features in AX that you can leverage. Or are you not doing anything at all? I know not everyone has SOD requirements, but even some of those that do sometimes aren't doing anything. So we just want to get an idea of what everyone's doing out there. And Jason will probably give it a couple more seconds here, and we'll get the results.
The results will be up in about 5 seconds here. I can tell you that manual does appear to be in the lead, though.
All right, so it looks like 26% are doing manual. We have 15% using a third-party tool, 12% using native AX, and then a few people that weren't able to answer. So that's great feedback. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin, and he wants to go through some of the SOD methodologies.
Thanks, Mike. So I appreciate everyone's time. I wanted to talk through the SOD methodologies and the approaches that one would take to go through cleaning up security if they had issues and they identified that there are significant issues within their security design. The first approach is taking a very targeted approach to remediating your security. So finding or fixing your existing AX security roles and users based on your high risks. So you might be certain high risks related to the company code or certain types of users. In those situations, you'd be very targeted and want to address those conflicts there. The second approach is actually redesigning and implementing security throughout the organization and ensuring that you have proper segregation of duties designed into your roles. Now, this second approach is more comprehensive, and it allows you to ensure that you've established solid building blocks within your roles for your overall security design, and as you roll that out to multiple locations, and provides that baseline for you to be scalable. So I wanted to go through the remediation approach one, where it's really targeted, and as we said, it's a risk-based approach. So if we walk through the slide, you'll see the different phases within the approach. The first thing, as we said, would be prioritizing where you want to perform your SOD remediation. So this is after you've already done your assessment, you've identified where your conflicts exist, and you understand what your current environment looks like. You can't go in through any one of these approaches without first understanding where you are and understanding the current state. Once you've understood that current state and you've prioritized those remediation efforts, you're going to start removing the privileges or roles that are causing the conflict. Typically, we would want to start at the role level and resolve those inter-role conflicts. But if you're being very targeted and you just want to remove it at the user level, there's an opportunity to just look at the user and understand what privileges or roles are causing conflict at the user level. Once you've understood and done your analysis on which privileges or roles need to be removed based on the high-level conflicts that you're trying to resolve, you would modify that access within the security design. Typically, you'd want to do this in a test environment just to make sure that anything that you're removing or updating is going through the proper change control processes, because you don't want to be changing things. Identify at the end that your end user doesn't have the ability to perform certain functions that they're supposed to be performing. So you want to make sure that when you modify anything that you're getting buy-off from the business and that they're testing to make sure that the functions that they are supposed to be able to perform, they can perform. The next thing that you want to do is go ahead and adjust your SoD rules to account for any false positives. So when we say false positives, there are opportunities where the tools that you use may identify what's something that is a conflict, but in reality based on either configuration or certain customizations that this doesn't really exist as a conflict within the system because the user isn't capable of performing both actions. In this situation, you need to adjust your SoD rules, modify the rule set, or document where there does exist a false positive so that you can record that for future use. This is something that is going to be existing within most automated tools. Automated tools are helping you automate the process, but they are based on rules, and those rules may identify these potential false positives. So you're going to want to adjust your rules accordingly. The final thing is for any what we would consider to be an accepted SoD conflict or risk, you want to identify mitigating controls for those. So if you've determined that within your business process that it's necessary for a certain individual to perform both functions, or you've determined it's necessary that a certain job role requires both these functions, and you understand their risks, but you have mitigating controls in place, you want to document those mitigating controls or create a mitigating control to manage that risk. In general, we would prefer that you actually mitigate the risk through security design, especially at the role level. But we understand based on your organization and based on your business, it's something that the business is going to have to decide what works best for them. So a high-level summary of the approach. When do you want to use it? When do you think that just being targeted is the best approach? So sometimes if you're just trying to identify quick wins and you want to show either senior leadership or executive management, that you were able to remediate a number of issues and create resolutions for a number of those issues. Sometimes you use approach 1 in combination with approach 2, which we'll talk about later, to show those quick wins initially and then create a more comprehensive and scalable model in the future. Another time that you would want to use this approach is if there are a minimal number of role level and user level conflicts. After you've done your assessment and you've identified that maybe you only have a few high-risk items that you really want to address, you'd want to be very targeted with that approach. Some of the disadvantages are, it can be very time-consuming to continue to go through this approach if you're trying to resolve issues once they pop up. You're constantly having to review and analyze to make sure that those issues don't exist in the future. And spending that time without the appropriate change management controls in place a lot of times will end up being more time-consuming than going through the process at the very beginning. Another thing is you may not address your real core issues by going through this targeted approach. Going through a more comprehensive approach allows you to get down to the lowest level of security and build from the bottom up. While in this situation, you're being very targeted and just pulling access from certain roles. So you may not address the significant issues, and you may not identify those issues until a new issue pops up. And then the final disadvantage is really that excessive access that's not reported may still be assigned to users. So you may still be assigning additional access that once you've finished your FastPath reporting, that access after that initial assessment will still be assigned. So addressing it at the process level is something that you'll want to do as well. So now we're going to go over the detailed approach for AX role design and what we would consider that top-down approach, or really establishing your framework and then moving through the holistic design of the security implementation. So when you're considering approach 2, one of the things that you want to do is just look at certain data points within your current design and determine if approach 2 is the most important for you. If you have a significant number of SoD conflicts within your roles, that may be a sign that you want to consider using approach 2 and going through a complete redesign. If your AX environment has more than a couple hundred active single roles, that may be something that you may want to look into, because that number of active single roles means that you have a lot of different roles with different levels of access, and it may not have been targeted for the very specific access that each role should have. If you don't have organization-specific SoD policies for monitoring, and if you haven't established those, you may want to consider approach 2. And then if there's a lack of business involvement in your SoD risk management process, this is another reason to consider approach 2. And when I say lack of business involvement, basically what that means is when you're granting access, are the business users who are approving this access actually trying to understand what the potential SoD risks are when granting new access to an individual? If they're not heavily involved in that process, that means the breakdown could be at that process level, and you want to make sure that you're assessing that, because if that breakdown is there, you'll find that you have maybe a significant level of conflicts within your environment. So now we'll move to the third poll question. And so the third poll question is, if you aren't currently reviewing your security, do you plan to? And so our options are yes in the next 6 months, yes in the next year, no, we don't have requirements that would make us review our security, no, we don't have resources to do it, no, we don't care about security, or we currently already have processes in place to review our security. Now, we understand some people may already have those processes. We also understand some people just don't have the resources to perform this, especially if you're doing this manually. That can be very time-consuming, and sometimes having the resources to perform the analysis can be very difficult to find.
I can tell you that looks like the most popular results so far are in the next 6 months or don't have a process in place, and then a few in those other 1 year or no requirements.
All right. So what I'm seeing is a lot of you do have processes in place, so that's wonderful that you guys are already going through this approach. And I think this kind of ties into one of the previous polls where we saw a lot of answers about people doing it manually or having automated solutions. So I want to walk through the approach for AX SoD role redesign and just give you a high-level overview of what that redesign process looks like. When starting with this approach, the first thing that you want to do is establish your framework. And that framework is going to be your SoD policies and your rule set design. And so when I say SoD policy, and we'll talk through this in a little bit more detail, but it's really the business concepts of your SoD rule set. So we talked through it previously with Mike, where he was talking about creating a supplier or vendor and issuing payment to that vendor. So that's going to be the business rule or the business policy that's going to drive your rule set and ultimately drive your security design. The first thing, identify the business processes that are going to be in scope. A lot of times you're going to have a number of business processes within your ERP that may not be applicable as it relates to segregation of duties and as it relates to risk mitigation and management. You may not care about certain processes around quality assurance or product lifecycle management. It really depends on your organization and what's most important to you. You then want to define your SoD policies according to your business practices. So that's going to be defining those key business elements and what the conflicting elements are, and what the risk levels are associated to those. Conduct your validation workshops. Work with the business to make sure that the business agrees on all the risks that you have, and then ultimately create your rule set based on those policies. So how do you identify your SoD policies? As we've discussed, you want to review your business processes and walk through what are those key business processes. You then identify policies that are not part of your standard SOT policies that come with your GRC tool. So as you're walking through your process, understand which activities are potential risks to your organization. And using process flow diagrams or Visio diagrams really allow you to understand how the activities are flowing and help you identify what potential business activities could be in conflict. In this example, you'll see one of the SOD risks that we identified is entering a PO and then receiving the goods for that PO. The next thing that you want to do, once you've identified what those critical activities are, you'll want to create what we consider to be that risk framework around what is important to you from a high, medium, and low perspective. And it's important to do things at a risk-based level because everyone has limited time and resources. And so you want to make sure that you're focused on what your key risks are. And then as you move up the maturity curve, you'll have the opportunity to address other risks that may not be as critical to you at the moment. So we recommend coming up with a framework that's going to define what high, medium, and low means to you. In this example, we've got high meaning physical and monetary loss or a system-wide disruption. So that could be a very high risk to your organization. With medium being data integrity or manipulation of multiple systems. And typically this is less of a financial risk to the organization. And then low being productivity losses or system failures on a single unit or operation. These typically are those risks that you can live without. You understand they're there. You want to monitor them and at least be aware of them. But based on your operations, these are things that you have to allow within your environment. And so this is just, I think, on a high-level view of the actual system administrator screen. One of the things that you want to do, and this is a key point, is when you're going through and building out your rule set and understanding what privileges and duties are going to be built into that rule set, is that you understand what customizations exist within your environment. If you've created a customization that allows your users to pay vendors through other screens or other menus, it's important to make sure that you capture that because that customization needs to be incorporated into your rule set. Otherwise, you'll never know that that risk exists. So once you've completed your SoD rule set design, you'll be ready to actually configure it into your GRC tool. And typically we use FastPath as the GRC tool of choice as it relates to the AX environment. But as we all know, you can use spreadsheets, you can use an Access database. There may be other tools, maybe in SQL that you're using to help pull those reports. But you want to configure that rule set within your tool. And then you want to be able to demonstrate to auditors that your company has considered all areas of your environment for proper SoD control. So this process is going to help show your auditors that you've thought through everything. You've thought through all of the processes and considered all of the risks.
So now we're going to move in and start talking about the actual redesign and walk through the approach of redesign our rules based on our SoD methodologies. So as we both, Kevin and I both talked about earlier, you really want to go in and try to design roles that are free of conflicts based in your SoD policies. So you want to have those policies in place. You need to go through the validation process with your business team. Identify, what rules you're going to evaluate from an SoD perspective. Assign different levels of risk levels to those, so you can, approach those in the correct fashion based on the risk that it poses to the business. So you really want to ideally design those roles so you don't have any intra-conflicts, so that when you assign a role to a user, they don't immediately have any conflicts. That's a really difficult thing to do. Out of the box, there are a number of template roles and duties and privileges that are provided with AX, and oftentimes there's a misconception that those are all SOD free. They've been validated. That's really not the case. So remember that the roles you get out of the box are just templates for you to start with, and then you really need to customize those to fit your business. And if you are going to go more with the task-based approach, you really need to identify what tasks need to be performed by your end users and design the rules around that with your SoD policy in mind. So the first thing is to build those policies. Then you want to go out, sit down with your business process owners, make sure you understand what the responsibilities are for each type of user in your system. And then as you begin building your roles out, you want to make sure you're testing those roles, both for SOD, for the intra-conflicts, but also for functionality. So you need to use either some sort of model users that you can go in and log in and test the system. So you can either create a user inside of AX and log in as that user, or there is one other feature you can use if you're using the security development tool. There's a feature in there to test roles where you can basically simulate a role and walk through what that functionality has, a user would have with that functionality. The one thing about that is that when you are going through that process with the security development tool, it only allows you to do one role at a time. So that covers when you want to test individual roles. But as I mentioned earlier, a user is going to have a number of roles assigned to them, and you really want to test that aggregate security profile. So with the security development tool, it's a little bit limited unless you're using sub-roles and doing grouping in that fashion. So typically, the same that we did in AX 2009 and AX 4, we're creating a test user inside of AX. We're logging in as that test user to actually determine if the user has the access they need in the system. You do want to identify the authorized SOD conflicts. So there are going to be cases where there are acceptable risk. So as a business, you've sat down and identified these are areas where we're going to accept a mitigated control for this risk, and you want to identify what those are. So that goes back to the risk levels I was talking about assigning. There may be certain conflicts that you deem to be critical or high, and you say that regardless of the user, no one can have this conflict. And so that's a rule within your company. But there are going to be other medium and lower level risk where you're going to recognize that the conflict is there. But, in order for you to be productive as a business, you realize that that conflict is necessary. And in those cases, you really want to identify what your mitigating controls are up front. So we know, if this user has this access, this is how we're going to mitigate the risk for that. And you can build your control library around that and have that in place when you begin designing your security roles. So in order to design those conflict-free roles, the first thing is to determine your approach. So are you going to go with more of a job-based approach where a role is going to consist of everything a person needs in order to perform their job? Those are oftentimes going to contain intra-conflicts because it's a much bigger security profile that's all included in a single role. Or are you going to go with the task-based approach, which is what Kevin's proposed? Going with the task-based approach allows you to really design your security in a way that is much more granular, and you're going to be able to go in and really lock down what a user has access to and design rules that are free of conflicts. So it's difficult to do it, but that's really the best way so that you can minimize the number of conflicts you have immediately when you just begin setting up users. If you can eliminate those intra-level conflicts, it's going to go a long way in helping with that process. You also want to review your business process flows. So you want to sit down with your actual end users and interview your end users. Find out what the business process owners, based on their knowledge, what do users actually need to perform in the system. Oftentimes you'll see, there's users that have way more access within AX than they really need or really use. And so you want to take away that access. You want to focus on just giving them access to what they really need to perform their job. So it's the least amount of security possible that you want to grant there. As you're doing that, when you're going through your redesign, you want to identify what access is currently out there. And, again, that's part of that process of remediating and taking away access that really isn't necessary. And also you may identify, maybe they have the role that they need, but the role has extra access. So let's fine-tune that and bring that back to the task-based role where they really focus on the specific things they need to perform that job function. So once you've done that, you can go ahead and build out your preliminary set of roles and privileges that are going to be tested against your SoD policies and begin building those inside of the tool. So you really have to go through all those steps and make sure you engage the different business owners throughout the process to make sure you ensure that users are going to be able to perform their job, but you're also using the least principal policy as far as granting security access when doing that. So as we go in here and start talking about that task-based approach, there are a number of advantages, and I've already touched on some of these, but it's really a way for you to design those conflict-free roles. It allows you to really target the more granular restrictive access. So, it's much smaller sets of security objects, so you're going to have a smaller set of things within that role that are really targeted at a specific user. That's going to allow you to only assign those actual tasks the user performs based on their job and really target exactly what they want to do. Oftentimes we see examples where, maybe you have 5 AP clerks in your company and 3 of them just do the base functionality and you have 2 others that do some additional things. So you're kind of stuck in that place of, well, do I create multiple roles, or do I create task-based roles and only assign the specific tasks they need, or do I just create one large AP clerk role and the 3 people that really don't need all that access just have extra access assigned to them? The last option obviously is the poorest approach. You don't want to grant that extra access, so you really need to use that thinking when you're going through your security design. And also taking that task-based approach reduces your security maintenance long-term, because as you do see additional security maybe is needed, maybe you have a customization, it's much easier to manage those smaller roles and add in additional functionality. And, if you find someone doesn't have the access they need additional access, it's much easier to manage those task-based roles over the long term as opposed to a larger role where the implication of modifying it could be greater. Now, one of the limitations to this is depending on the granularity you go to, even if you're using task-based roles, you still could be granting additional access to a user that they don't need. If your tasks are at a high enough level that, again, you're at that AP clerk and you're granting more access within the task than what a standard AP clerk does, you could still find yourself granting access beyond what the individual really needs to perform their job. So you want to be careful and make sure you really determine and identify how you want to approach designing those roles. The other limitation is that you're going to see much more roles assigned to a user. And sometimes that becomes harder to manage. When you're going out and provisioning a user, it's much easier to say, okay, I created John and he needs the AP clerk role, than to say I created John and he needs 5 roles because they're very task-based. So there is a little bit more maintenance from that perspective of at the user level where they're going to have more roles than normal. But at the end of the day, John's only going to have the access that he really needs. He's not going to have that extra access. So when you come to do your compliance reporting, your SoD analysis, you're going to be much happier with the more restrictive access setup. So another thing you want to think about is your naming conventions around your roles. So as you're going through this process, you want to make sure that you're consistent, and you want to come up with a naming convention that fits your company. This is just an example that often is used. You can see here that it's starting out with a sub-process indicator. So we have AP. Everything's delimited up there by an underscore. The middle of the role name here has the role description. So it's check processing. That's really what this role does. And then at the end, we keep, the type of role. Is this a display role? Is it an edit role? Is it a maintain role? Whatever your terminology is, you can actually tack that on. And by really using a consistent approach, this is going to help you over the long term to maintain your roles. It's going to make it much easier for you to do that. So as you're going through your role design, you want to make sure you really capture all of the information that goes along with this. The name, what access is going to be in this role. All of that information needs to be part of the design. So when you provide this out to your developer, they really have all the information they need to go build that role. They're going to have the technical knowledge to build the role, but from a functional perspective, you need to provide them with that information, and then allow them to, to put that in place in the system. We do have a few examples here of just some roles and some of the, privileges or duties that are contained within those. So as you're going out and designing those task-based roles, you can determine, what actual functions they need access within that actual role. The next portion is the actual technical portion of setting up the role. So we went through the role design, and we've done it at a functional level, exactly what we want within that role to meet our SoD requirements. Now we need to actually go out and build that role into the system. So part of that process, and this is where it's going to involve some technical expertise at times. There are functionality to build it inside of AX, the standard interface, but a lot of the security can be, well, not a lot. Security resides in the AOT, so it can be done from a technical perspective by your developers, and it is impacted by, what they're doing when they're building out forms and menu items and those types of things. So first off, you want to go out and define what permissions belong to each role. So what needs to be within a role? I need to know that before I really start. Then I want to start building out my roles. So I'm going to build that role, assign the necessary permissions. Then I'm going to use my model users to actually go out and test the functionality. Does this role grant the access I need in order for this user to do their job? Is it giving me all of the permissions that are required for them to complete that job function or that task? Come up with a user provisioning strategy. So, what are you going to use to actually go out and assign your roles to users? So as I mentioned earlier, depending on your approach, you may have more roles or less roles to assign to a user. So how are you going to actually provision those users? And when you're provisioning them, how are you going to analyze the SoD portion of your setup when you have that aggregate security setup? And then also come up with a change management process. How are you going to go through authorizations for your role assignments or modifications to your roles? How are you going to document that? You need to be able to provide that information to your auditor so that you can show that things aren't going on in your system or being modified in your system that were not authorized. So you want to make sure that you have a process in place that you can show to your auditor and also enact in your own environment. So one of the things you really need to do in order to accomplish that is establish continuous monitoring procedures. So when you go live with your, clean slate environment, you need to monitor that going forward to ensure that you don't create additional conflicts as users are provisioned into your system, or as security is modified within your system. So there are really two types of monitoring. There are preventative controls. Preventative controls are going to look up front when you assign security to an asset or to a user. They're going to actually monitor that provisioning to look at your user security profile to determine if any conflicts have been created by that security setup. So one of the things that we do here at FastPath, we have an identity manager tool that we actually allow you to go in and put a workflow around your user provisioning process. So you can have your business process owners submit requests for user access. That access can be reviewed by the approvers, and they can take into account any conflicts that will be created by the access you're requesting, and then they can determine if they want to approve that or deny it and send it back for changes. And so that allows you to come up with that automated process where you have really a workflow around it. You're doing your preventative monitoring of your system to see what conflicts are created. And also there are tools in FastPath that allow you to simulate what would happen if I assigned these 3 roles to a user. What conflicts would be created? So you can leverage that type of tooling, whether you're provisioning users or if you're designing security, you can be evaluating the impact on SOD. So I know some of you out there may have other processes. That's how we approach it here at FastPath. But you may have other approaches where maybe you have a manual sign-off process or you have something in place. Regardless of the tool, you want to just make sure that you have some sort of control around that so you can provide that out to your auditor. And then the second type is detective continuous monitoring. So now that we've looked at security as it went in the system, we need to review SOD on an ongoing basis. So long term, how are we looking to make sure, we do that initial push of security. You have to remember roles and duties and tasks. There's a lot of moving parts in the security model that can be modified that could gain additional access for a user. So you want to continually be monitoring your system to review what's set up in the system to understand what conflicts exist out there. And again, here at FastPath, we use our Assure tool. That tool comes with a rule set around segregation of duties where we go out and we run reports against our system or a customer system to continuously monitor what conflicts they have in the system, and they can even document their mitigating controls so that they can identify if any conflicts have popped up that aren't authorized or have not been documented with a compensating control. So, that's, again, how we approach that we go out and we're going to analyze all of your users, all of their role assignments, and all of the access those roles have. But, you need to look at if there's other manual processes you may have in place today to go ahead and accomplish that. So I'll turn it back over to Kevin. He's going to talk about some of the detailed approach of the SOD design, or I'm sorry, the quality assurance.
Thanks, Mike. So once you've actually finished your technical build and design and you've got the roles tested for functionality and in place, one of the things that you want to do is then start performing quality assurance to validate that your roles that you developed don't have conflicts within them. Someone can go through all of the planning and prepping and testing of the design process, but a lot of times we're going to find that there's still issues that we need to address at the end. So you're going to want to populate your GRC tool with the SOD rules that we designed at the very beginning of this process. And as Mike said, we can use FastPath and we can use other tools, but you want to make sure that rule set has the appropriate privileges or table structures within your rule design. Then you're going to want to run your violation reports using that tool. And so the important thing here is making sure that your tool has the ability to report on intra-role conflicts. And as Mike said at the very beginning of this, an intra-role conflict is that conflict between that conflict that exists within a single role. And I know we talked about the concept of authorized conflicts. Now, the authorized conflicts, you want to make sure that you understand what those authorized conflicts are. Now, the authorized conflict may be because it's a false positive and you want to document that within your system and call it an authorized conflict. You may have mitigating controls in place or certain configuration in place that is managing the risk of that conflict. So you want that to be an authorized conflict as well. But you want to make sure that you document what those conflicts are. And then you want to validate that all of your authorized conflicts are appropriately authorized. So you may have identified mitigating controls. Let's go make sure that that mitigating control actually works. And a lot of times I find when we go through this process, there are companies who say, oh, we have a mitigating control. This person reviews this manual journal entry report on a monthly basis. And then you go talk to the person that's supposed to be reviewing that report, and you find out that they haven't been reviewing the report for 6 months. So you want to make sure that your mitigating controls are actually managing the risk and actually operating. Then you'll want to go through the design process and build process again for any unauthorized conflicts. So you'll be working with your developer. You'll be adjusting your design documents and fine-tuning everything to make sure that any of those unauthorized conflicts don't exist within your role structures. And one thing to note is this is an iterative process. You're going to go through your quality assurance. You're going to test using FastPath. You're going to find that there's unauthorized conflicts. You're going to have to go back to the design, adjust it, have your technical architect go through and actually redesign those roles. And then you're going to have to go through the test process again. Ultimately, your goal is to eliminate all the unauthorized conflicts. And so just making sure that everyone understands that's an iterative process. And it may take 1 try, and it may take 3 tries. But it's important to make sure that you go through the process to ensure that you've eliminated all of those unauthorized conflicts. The next thing that you're going to want to do is then start testing and preparing to move to production. So you want to conduct system testing for all your new AX roles. Make sure that the roles are capable of doing all the functional requirements. We've already done this as part of the build. We've done some testing there, but we want to make sure that user acceptance testing and everyone is comfortable with the roles that they have and has the capabilities to perform the activities that they need to perform. You want to remediate any identified security or system issues. So as someone's going through the system, and they may identify that they have the ability to perform 2 functions that are in conflict. You want to dig into that issue and understand what the source of the issue is and ultimately resolve that. The next thing is performing user mapping. So assigning users to those roles and making sure that you understand what users are going to have what roles within the system, because you're going to have to assign all those roles to those users actually in the application. So a lot of times I've seen this done through a spreadsheet or some sort of matrix where you have all of the roles listed either down the side or on the top. And then you've got all of your individuals who are going to require access. You basically put an X within each role that user is going to require for their daily job functions. Then you're going to actually run a tool to understand where your violations are at the user level. The important thing here is once you've identified those violations at the user level, you're probably going to have mitigating controls that you want to document as part of your resolution and your risk mitigation strategy. So you want to document those mitigating controls, and you want to make sure that within your tool that you have articulated that these conflicts are no longer conflicts that you want to address going forward. One of the big pitfalls I've seen whenever someone goes live with a tool and a process to assess security, they haven't cleaned up what currently exists in the environment. And what they do is if they've decided to have a manual process where they review on a weekly basis or an annual or monthly basis, they end up with a lot of noise from other conflicts because they weren't documented or removed appropriately. So that's one of the pitfalls that you'll want to avoid. I know we are running short on time, so I'm going to try to work through the rest of the slides fairly quickly so we can get to questions. This is just a dashboard. Here's an example of something that you can use to articulate your testing status for each one of your roles. This is just an example. It helps you really understand where you are at with the testing process and provide executive and project management an understanding of where things are and how we're doing within the process. The next step that we talked about is preparation and move to production support. The key activities here, just making sure that all the users have the assigned roles, that you've trained most of the individuals, that you've set up processes for people to communicate issues, and making sure that they have a way to follow up with you if they're having any access issues and any security issues where they're not able to perform their functions. Some of these considerations for go live. Migration to production should make sure that you follow your change management policy, make sure that you've gone through your standard SDLC control processes and gotten buy-off from all the right teams. Make sure you have that communication plan in place so if affected users need to reach out, they can, and have a dedicated support team there to address any issues that are encountered by the organization. One of the things that we say is no matter how well UAT goes, you're going to have issues and you're going to find those issues. And the only thing that you as an IT organization or an organization can do is make sure that you're prepared to address those. This slide is just an example timeline when you're talking to your management team and setting up the project. Show them what that timeline is going to be and show them the different activities that are going to be associated with that timeline. And this is just a high-level view of, when you're going through this project, who's going to be involved in each one of the activities and what their level of effort is going to be. This is what we typically see. It's not the answer, but it's something that we see pretty regularly as far as what the level of impact and time is going to be required by each one of the different organizations or people within the organization. Key points. So incremental remediation may not be as efficient depending on what's, what your organization is going through, the processes that you have. SoD risk management starts by establishing your SoD policies for the organization. Best practices are that your AX roles are conflict-free and should be based on and considering your SoD policies. Make sure that business and other stakeholder involvement in the design and validation of your policies so that you get that business buy-off. Project sponsorship is necessary to ensure that all the milestones are met and that you have the proper business support as it relates to UAT. And one of the things is making sure that you have proper processes in place after you go live to ensure that you stay clean. You don't want to go through this project again, so you need to make sure that you have processes in place to eliminate or at least mitigate the risk of having issues in the future. I think with that said, we're at the question portion. I tried to get through those last slides quickly, but and I know we're over time, but Jason, I'll handle it over to you.
All right, great. And do you have a couple extra minutes to answer questions? We have a few that have come in.
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. I guess the first one is kind of more general, but a few people have asked about access to the slides and to the recording. I can tell everyone that there is a recording that we're making, and we'll be making that available within the next few days. But if people want the slides, I know you have your contact information. Do you want people to reach out directly?
Yeah, that'd be fine. They could go ahead and email us directly if they have questions.
Okay. So the first question here, asking what are some best practices to keep business users alert to potential SoD conflicts?
So there's a couple of things with that. One thing I would say is, the detective and the preventative controls we talked about, identifying when you do go in and request access or assign access to a user, put an approval process around that so you can do your testing of SOD before security is assigned within the system. And then also with the detective approach, that's where you want to monitor your system long term. So, you can go out, you can run the reports manually, you can also set up automated reporting. For example, in our tools, you can go out and set up a report where it's going to go out and run a report periodically scheduled to test your SoD policies. And you could even set up filters where you could say, we've documented mitigations for all of these conflicts. Show me any time something, enters the system that hasn't been mitigated, and you can have that set up to be delivered via email or, stored out to the network, those types of things. So it's really about process and making sure you're continually monitoring the system.
All right, great. Does user security in AX affect licensing with Microsoft?
Yes. In AX, the security or your licensing is actually directly impacted by security. So depending on a user's access in the system, what menu items they actually have access to based on what entry points they have access to, which are primarily menu items, based on all their roles, duty, and privilege assignments, that will determine what license level a user requires. So you want to be very careful that when you are designing your task-based roles, that's also going to benefit you from a licensing perspective. Only grant users access to what they really need, because if you go back to the AP clerk example, when someone gets access beyond what their real requirements are, that could impact their licensing, that it's bumping them up to a higher license level for something they don't even use. So that's something we've heard a lot from customers. We've actually built some features into our tools so when they're reviewing security access and doing their role design, they can actually see what impact and what license level different users and roles require in the system.
And Mike, to add on to that, I've seen that a lot of the software vendors are starting to perform more licensing audits to validate, the licenses per the contract or the latest negotiation and agreement actually match what's written down. So something that organizations should be aware of, because there are, software vendors out there going through those audits.
All right, we have one more question in the queue, so I'll make a last call right now. And also, I'll just mention we do have a quick survey that pops up after the session. We really appreciate you watching out for that after we conclude today and just taking 15 or 20 seconds to give us some feedback on today's event. So here we go. How do you handle SOD in a small group where a person leaves for vacation and the role needs to be granted to do the work that might conflict with the SOD?
What we've seen typically is that access is going to be granted, but they implement temporary monitoring procedures to validate. So they may pull reports at the end to just validate what activity was performed by the user or what specific potential conflicting activities are needed to be monitored, and they'll pull reports and evaluate that access. That's typically what I've seen, Mike.
Yeah, there's a couple things. One thing that I point out to customers is oftentimes when someone does go on vacation, you assign that additional access to someone. A lot of times people forget to go take it away. So now you have someone that has additional access and it never is removed. So you do want to make sure you have policies in place to make sure that that access is actually removed after the fact. So again, there's things like expiration dates, effective dates. Those are some of the things we use in our tools to, with Identity Manager to automate that so that you have the approval of it, the security going in the system, and then you have effective dates that actually revoke the access at the end of that period. So again, you could do that with your manual process. You just need to make sure that you have some sort of process around that to document that. Now, the other thing, in addition to what Kevin said, is you do grant that access and monitor what they're doing in the system, and that monitoring could be done a couple ways. One, it could be done through going out and just reviewing the data that exists in the system and what they entered. Another approach would be to use like a data tracking type scenario where you turn on auditing to track what that user's doing. while they're, during that 2-week period, I'm going to monitor, did they create any vendors or edit any vendors and validate what they did during that time period. And so around that, we have an audit trail tool that does that, and then the database log is what's inside of AX that you can maybe leverage to do that as well. So it's really about tracking or doing some sort of reconciliation on what they did during that time period.
Okay, would it make sense to start having the users give us insight through the AX recorded process instructions on the functions of AX as a way of communicating how many roles there will be and who will be assigned each role?
Sorry, I'm just going to read that question again. There's a lot of content there. Yeah, so what I think they're asking is, can you go in and track exactly what a user's doing to determine what functions a user's using and then determine what roles to build off of that? There's definitely a lot of customers that want to do that. They want to go out and track what functionalities a user actually using on a day-to-day basis and then start building around that. So in AX7, there's a new task guide feature that you could use potentially to do some of that. It doesn't translate directly into a security role, but you could leverage the information you're capturing or the task recorder type feature in the older version. So it definitely is an approach to do it. There's not a single right or wrong way to do it, but that's definitely a good way to do it. So then you're actually looking at what the user's really using in the system. The thing you want to take into account are those, month-end processes, year-end processes. You want to make sure that you also include those when you're going through your role design, that you have someone go through that process so that you don't get to year-end and all of a sudden people can't actually complete what they need to do. So it is a great way to do it. It just depends on if that's the approach you want to take or not.
All right. Well, that's the last question in our queue, so we're going to start wrapping up. I know there were folks who were interested in reaching out to find out about access to slides and access to the recording, and I don't know if you guys want to put your contact information up as we close out here, but let me just take an opportunity, Mike and Kevin, just to say thanks for your time today.